Okay, I think the beeps sort of tapered down now. So, Dr.
Yes.
Brown, please go ahead.
All right. Hello, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Homero Pino, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Charles Drew University. But Homero works very hard, and because of that, he also has a position as associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the UCLA School of Medicine. He also serves as a research health scientist at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System's Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Center. So this is someone with boundless energy. Dr. Del Pino's research focuses on the impact of family relationships on health outcomes among sexual minority men of color across the lifespan, with an emphasis on substance use and HIV risk. Homero is both the leader in this program and also he was a RCMAR scholar back in 2014. And of note, Dr. Del Pino recently won the Outstanding Faculty Award for Excellence in Research at Drew. He also has a history of work on ethical issues, particularly on judgment and action, which I think we can all appreciate at this moment. But today, Dr. Del Pino will present on how to present using PowerPoint slides, both on best practices and common pitfalls. This is super important for all of us if you teach, if you present, and also relevant to make sure that we meet our objectives for our learners. So join me in giving him a very warm welcome, Dr. Elpino. Dr. Homero Lupino, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brandon, for that introduction. So hello, everyone. How are you all doing?
Good.
So before I get started, first I want to thank RCMAR CHIME for the opportunity to be here and to give this talk. And before I start, I would also like to invite some of you to please turn on your cameras. You might appreciate my position. Talking into a black void is a little bit challenging. So being able to see people's faces, just helps me. And help me help you, so this is not boring. So if I can see how people are responding, reacting, right, it kind of helps with what we're going to do here today. So thank you for turning on your cameras. I appreciate it. Okay, so public speaking strategies. I think it's always good to start with humor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is one of my favorite go-to slides. If anyone has ever seen me do a talk before, they'll recognize this slide. What if I told you that reading a PowerPoint aloud isn't the same as teaching? I hate it when people read their PowerPoints to me. I feel that I can read faster. So why are you reading your PowerPoint slides out loud to me? I find that very annoying, so I try not to do that. And more importantly, if all I do is talk to you, you're going to get bored very quickly. So feel free to interrupt me and ask questions, and we can make this as engaging and as participatory as possible, rather than me just yapping away at you. Okay, so what we will cover today, myths and truths of effective speaking. We will talk some technical details about slides, and we'll also talk a little bit about delivery strategies. Okay, so myths and truths of effective speaking. And I just want to point out something here. Again, I'm going to cover this later, but since I'm doing it now in the slide, I just want you to notice. It's usually good to give people a map of what to expect in your presentation. Think about when you've gone to talks and you're not sure where it's going or what's going to happen. You're just kind of sitting there waiting to see where this goes. As opposed to right now, I just told you what are the three things we're going to cover. So you kind of prepare yourself and you know what to expect. And inevitably, people in your presentation, people in your audience, might get distracted, doze off. And when they come back to the slides, how do they know where you are in your talk? Right? So I like to use slides like this, where I'll put up the areas I'm going to cover and then highlight where I am in the presentation. So especially if you have a long talk or you're doing presenting research or new information, I think it's always useful to have what I think of as signpost slides. So people always know where you are, or where they are rather, in the presentation and what to expect. So some myths and truths. So I did borrow a lot of these slides from Dr. David Rubin, who used to give a presentations, trainings for scholars in the geriatrics division a few years ago. So one of the myths, to be credible, all medical talks need to have a scientific component. This may be familiar to some of you. Uh, this thought that somehow if your talk is going to be good or serious, it needs to be super technical, right? The science needs to be way up here. But that's just a myth, right? You can give a very credible talk without having it full of jargon, right? You can explain science without using formulas, for example. You need to be funny to be a good speaker. I think we are all entertained by funny speakers and amusing speakers, but that's only one kind of good speaker, right? So what I would like to encourage you all to think about is not, we can always improve as speakers, right? But it's not about how do you become like someone else? Like we all cannot be Barack Obama as a public speaker, right? Or Michelle Obama as a public speaker, right? But how can you be a better public speaker? So we all don't need to be funny and entertaining to be effective. So we can be effective speakers in our own style. So the important point I want to emphasize here is that it's important to develop your own style as well, of how you like to give talks and not try to be like someone else. You need to be serious as speaking to students or residents, especially when especially when they're students or residents, and we think that somehow we're in a higher position or in a faculty position that somehow we need to present our best selves and be professional, etc. That doesn't really help because that's what comes across and takes center stage rather than the content that you want to communicate. So students or residents, lay people, colleagues, it's all the same. And we'll talk a little bit more further along about how to think about your audience. And one of my favorite myths, if it needs to be said, it should be on the slide. I think we've all been to presentations that are full of text and pictures and just all this information. And it's not necessary, and I'll explain to you a little later why, but it's not necessary. At the end of the day, you're the speaker, not the slide, right? You're the one providing the information, not the slide. So just because something is important does not mean it has to be on the slide. Is a four-letter word. Yes, there are public speaking courses where they say never say right? But the truth is when we speak naturally with our friends, with our colleagues, when we are not in presentation mode, right? We usually use We stop, we pause, we think, and that's okay. Again, I think if you develop a style for yourself that's natural to you and it's natural to your audience, it would be okay to say Any questions on these myths actually before I continue? Actually, before I continue, a quick show of hands. Have any of you believed any of these myths before? Yes, I certainly have. Okay. So, what are some truths about effective speaking? The truth is that some people are more gifted than others. There's no doubt about that. Some people are just naturally gifted, more verbal, funnier, etc. But again, that you don't have to be like them. We don't have to be like them, right? And that doesn't mean that we can't have an effective style, which is the most important thing at the end of the day. And why do I say that? Because all speakers can improve. Even people who've been speaking for many years, you can always improve. You can always get just a little bit better. And a lot of faculty rely too much on content and too little on presentation style. So we're so worried about what's in our slide and all the information that we need to communicate that we forget it's not just how you say it. It's not just, sorry, what you say, but how you say it. right? And so when we think in this presentation here right now, what I want us to think about is how do we say it? How do we present it? But you already are content experts. When you're invited to give a talk, I'm going to say 99% of the time, you will know more about your topic than your audience does. So stressing about the content and the facts and figures is overkill. The emphasis is better placed on how are you going to present this information? How are people going to receive this? What is the best way to present this? So a little less on content and a little more on style, which is usually the opposite. When you do science, you're so focused on substance, right? And the truth is that effective speakers have a wide range of styles to select from. So I was encouraging just a few minutes ago to develop your own style, but it's also good to consider developing a few styles, right? Like you can have a funny person, you can have a funny persona, right? You can have the more serious person that gives a talk, right? You can have the persona who uses sort of like, down to earth language, right? These are different strategies that you use so you can adapt to your audience, right? So the idea that somehow we're going to be the same person with all our audiences is crazy, I think, right? We adapt to our audiences, and the more you develop different styles, different approaches, take risks to try new things, the easier it'll be for you to adapt to your audience over time. And now just a quick overview before you get started. Speaking of audience, so who is your audience? It's probably the first thing you need to ask yourself when you're doing your presentation. Why are they there? What don't they know? Why are you the speaker there? Right? So who is your audience? Right? So in this case, I would venture to say my audience are people who give talks, have given presentations before, and feel that maybe they want to learn a little bit more. Right? And when I think about what don't they know, I'm going to guess maybe the best way to use slides. Right? So it's not necessary to do a poll and have a scientific data before I prepare my presentation, but it's a good idea just to have a sense of who your audience is. And this is important. What is your message? I know when we do science, when you think from the point of view of writing a paper, you sort of have a results section and you present all these things that you found, right? But all the things that you found don't go into a single presentation. Your presentation will usually be around one or two things that you found. And even then, like, what is the take-home message? When people leave in 10 words or less, what do you want people to repeat from your presentation? Do you want them to say, oh, that was a great talk on, caretakers for people with dementia over 70, right? What do you want people to be able to say? What is your take-home message? And what do you want to accomplish, and what will it take to accomplish it? And by this, I mean, when you give your talk, are you trying to, for example, encourage people to drink more water? If that's what I want to accomplish, how will I accomplish that? Do I want to show what people look like dehydrated? Do I want to show facts and figures of what happens when we are dehydrated? Do I want to show table graphs? Do I want to share a personal story of what happened to me when I was dehydrated or what happened to someone that I know when they were dehydrated? Right. So again, these things kind of go together. What is it that you're trying to accomplish and how are you going to accomplish that? And the how is the, table, a story, anecdote, a figure. Any questions before I move on to this next part? No? Okay. I must be a riveting speaker. Okay, how to organize your talk. You'll always have an opening. Some people, I know this sounds very basic, or to me it sounded basic until you realize, think of talks that you've gone to that weren't very good. usually people jump right into the talk, right? So you want to have an opening, you want to engage your audience before getting into the body of your presentation and then your conclusions, right? And you want these to be very clear and explicit as you go along in your presentation. So when you think of the opening, what are the very first words that you are going to say is one way to think about your presentation. When you're getting ready to give a presentation, what is the first thing that you're going to say? What are the first words out of your mouth? And if you approach it that way, I think you'll be a little more careful, right? And more intentional about how you start your presentation. Even if it's a presentation you've given before, right? Especially, I would argue, if it's a presentation you've given before because you get comfortable, right? And you want to be intentional. How do you want to start your talk? What is the first thing you want people to hear when they hear your voice? Do you need to say something about yourself? So in this case, I had, I was lucky to have Brandon introduce me, so you know a little bit about who I am. And more importantly, I think in the introduction, you hopefully remember that I was also a RCMAR scholar, once upon a time, right? So to me, that's important for people to know that I went through this program as well. So what do people need to know about you, right? Do you need to establish credibility? Do you need to establish connection? Like, hey, we're in the same community. I feel you, right? Or credentials, like what is it that you need to do? What is it that you need to share about yourself to get started? And this is connected to knowing your audience. Do you need a hook? A joke, an anecdote, story, statistic, a concern, something that'll capture the audience's attention and connect you to the audience, right? So I like and I have not gotten good at this, but I've read, it's always good to use something called social math. Like if I said 20,000 people, I don't know, got a new infection, right? That sounds ambiguous versus, two stadium fulls. It's like enough people to fill two stadiums, enough people to fill all of, or there are more students in LAUSD than there are residents in Wyoming, right? So you get these sort of social comparisons to give you a sense of how big, right, the number of students at LAUSD is. Bigger, more students there than an entire state, right? So using things like this sometimes helps to kind of bring your audience in, right? And provide context and value. At the end of the day, when you are giving your talk, why is this important? Why is your talk important? And what I like to think of as one of the most important scientific questions is, who cares? Why is this important? And I'm not saying that from the standpoint of putting down science, right? But if you're going to give a talk, like, why does this matter? Why would someone want to sit there for half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour, or even an hour just to listen to you? Right. So when you ask yourself that question, why is this important? And you use that to prepare your slides and prepare what you're going to say, I think it can improve how you present. And as I was explaining earlier, tell them what you're going to cover so that people are always on board with you and they know where you're headed and what you are doing. So the body of your presentation, this is where you develop the message that you want to give. And your body should tell a story. The body of your presentation should tell a story, right? It'll be well organized and connected, something that has a very clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end, right? No cliffhangers, no stopping in the middle of your story or presentation. Again, it might seem obvious to you, but you want to know this is where my presentation begins. The meaty part of the presentation, not the intro stuff. This is where my presentation begins. This is a highlight, and this is how it ends. And always have evidence to support what you're trying to say. And evidence can be in the form of data, but can also be stories and anecdotal. Again, it depends on your audience and it depends on the purpose of your presentation. And when you conclude, you want to summarize the key points. I think it's usually good. What I usually do when I give a scientific talk is I'll go back to the very beginning and just remind people. We talked about, you know, we talked about, disparities in aging. We talked about the disparities in health. We talked about this and this and that. I provided some solutions or what I think are some solutions. And this is the conversation that we had around that point. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. Some of you were skeptical. And so just going to sum up what our experience together has been like. At least that's what I try to do when I give a scientific talk. Any questions? We just covered the myths and truths of effective speaking and some tips on presenting. Let me ask you all this. Is there something about effective speaking that you want to share now that you would like to share with us, or something that has worked for you? Not everybody all at once. Raise your hands. Something that you think has worked for you. Helen.
I actually wanted to ask you a question. So
Sure.
you brought up a point about, social math or what have you, um, something like what you said is, would definitely grab people's attention. Um, do you find that there are certain resources you can use where those are more readily available, or do you end up doing a lot of your own searching and figuring out a lot of that on your own? Like, how do you?
I tend to do my own searching
Mhm.
or ask people,
Yeah. I
and
mean, it feels like they might not be all that readily available, interesting
yeah,
facts like that. Yeah.
yeah, no, they're not readily available. So the example of the LAUSD in Wyoming, like I came up with that one by accident. And I
Mm,
was talking to someone that I met who was from Wyoming, and I asked him, oh, like, I forgot how it came up, but he told me Wyoming has a population of like 500,000, 450,000, something like that. And I remember thinking, wow, that's less students than the LA Unified School District.
mm,
And it just kind of stayed with me.
yeah.
Um, but the reason why I also think it's important to search and ask people is because you don't want to reinvent the wheel,
Mhm.
right? Like if there's something there that's already been said or is already funny and people, there's something that's in pop culture, right? Then just use that. Again, it's just a hook. It's just to provide an opening.
Yeah. Well, then I'll respond to you too,
Sure.
your question. So I have found that it's very helpful um, to bring it down to the personal level, even as a speaker, is to find a way, obviously icebreakers, which, I'm sure are things that you find help, that you might have an opinion about too, but also just to make it more human, to demystify yourself as a speaker oftentimes will help.
I agree. I actually do like icebreakers, but again, it depends on the audience. And it depends also on the format. So in a Zoom talk, I haven't tried that, icebreakers, because it's easy for people to not participate, right? But yeah, I'm all for icebreakers. They could be a lot of fun. And my own personal style, I'd rather be more personable,
Mhm.
right, than a cold professional, And interestingly enough, and this is an aside, I read somewhere that someone did a study that um, if women were too friendly, then they weren't perceived to be as smart. Only when they were like cold, right, and professional were they deemed to be smart. Whereas men got to be cold and professional or warm and friendly, and they were always deemed smart. So, I'll leave that
I'm
with
sure
you.
the women on this call are very familiar with all of these
Yeah.
kinds of. Yes, we've got plenty of those to battle with.
Yeah. So again, know your audience, know what you're dealing with. And sometimes I think, you know, I had a mentor who I thought was really brilliant, very humble. You wouldn't know it, but when she gave a presentation, it was like she just lit up the stage, right, with her talk. So I always felt like, well, she didn't have to be cold and professional, quote unquote, all the time, right? Like she was just herself, warm and friendly person. But when she was on stage, it was a whole other person. So, anyways, I just shared that with you.
I had a quick question. I don't know if
Yeah.
this might come up in your next one. Actually,
Sure.
the formatting of slides. I don't know if
Mhm.
a myth or something that I've been told often is have some type of graphic on every slide, and things like that. Whether it's, I don't know, like a figure or something. You might
I
go into that on how to use slides, but
I am going to go into that, but I'm glad you raised that. It's exactly what we're going to talk about. And if I don't answer your question or you disagree, please chime in, and I'll give you my opinion on graphics and slides. Um, so how to use slides? I found these slides, again, Don't Reinvent the Wheel from Seth Godin. The problem doesn't lie with your innovation. The problem lies with your presentation. It's never the science that's the problem when we give talks. It's always how we present it. Again, not what we say, it's how we say it. So I like these slides and I'm going to focus on these for a bit, right? So some of the basics. You want to budget 1 slide per minute of presentation. So especially for scholars, when you're told you have a 10-minute talk to give, right? 10-minute talk, 5-minute Q&A, no more than 10 slides, right? It's usually about a slide per minute. Again, it's just a way to gauge how much time you're going to take up. And when you do research presentations, usually it's just, again, 1 slide for your title slide, a slide for your research questions, background, 1 to 2 slides if necessary. And this goes back to what I said earlier, the myth, if it's important, it needs to go on a slide. You can talk about important things in the background, so important things about the background to your study without putting it on a slide. Your methods, 2 to 4 slides, that does tend to get a little more detailed. Your results, 2 to 5 slides, that's where the meat of your work is, right? Your results, your conclusions, and acknowledgement. Sometimes acknowledgements are just tagged at the bottom at the end, and you just mention it. Sometimes people put entire slide to itself. So some of the common problems with the slides. So too many colors. You may have noticed that these slides I've been using are very plain. But also, I've also been doing a lot of talking. So we're not reading through these slides together, right? So when people put too many colors, it gets confusing to the eye. If it's too crowded, too much information, too many graphs and figures, that can also be a problem. Again, too many symbols on a graph. So even when you do use a graph, right, if you have all kinds of symbols and p-values all over the place, like people don't know where to look. And I'll elaborate on that in a second. And I'm not against graphs because sometimes, yes, using graphics would be better than using words, right? A picture, it speaks 1,000 words. Sometimes you should use a graph, right? But use them judiciously. And some things to keep in mind, some important rules. Your slides should be self-evident. Think about when people say, sometimes they're like, can I get a copy of your slides? Right? You're not there to explain what you were thinking. So if they look at your slide afterwards, they should be able to know what it's about. Like each of the slides in your presentation, like what this is about. Right? So you only have necessary information on it. Again, as I mentioned before, avoid mega data slides. And typically no more than 2 graphics per slide. And the graphs should not show too much detail. Because too much detail does not help. People can't see all of that. And more importantly, I think, and I'm going to reiterate this in a bit, people get lost, right? So if you put a big graph, people will start getting ahead of you. Where's the p-value? Which color, which bar is bigger than the other? What is this really saying? Meanwhile, you're talking, right? You have the key information, but their minds is somewhere else, right? So that's one of the drawbacks, I think, of relying too much on graphics and slides. You will lose your audience. Now, that's not to say we should never use graphics and slides. So how much should be on a slide? One major point per slide. Think of a slide like a paragraph, right? Like your paragraph is 1 point, your main sentence and some supporting information, right? That's your slide. One major point per slide. Each line is a basic thought. The rule is 7 lines by 7 words. Here we have 4 lines, right? And don't have visuals tell everything. And I'll explain again why in a minute. But the 7 lines by 7 words maximum, I think, is important. You may have seen slides that have a whole bunch of text. It's like they ripped a page out of a book and just pasted it on the slide. It's like, how do you read all that? And then they start reading to you. So for me, when I do slides, I do my best to keep every point, whatever I'm going to say to a single line, a bullet point, a line, right? Nothing that goes over 2 or 3 lines. Yes, sometimes it cannot be helped, but I try hard to keep everything in 1 line. It's easier for people to read, and it's easier for me to just remember, right? It just kind of triggers a thought, triggers a memory of what I'm supposed to say about this. So here's a graph, or here's a picture. And when you see this, like, where do you even begin? Right? So if I were presenting on this, maybe I want to go from left to right. Maybe I want to start in the middle, right? But if I were sitting in the audience, I would be trying to figure out, like, where does this all begin? And I would not be paying attention to the speaker anymore, right? And it has so many colors. So which is the most important color here? Or is something supposed to really stand out? Do these colors go in order, or is this just decoration? Like, is it just designed differently just for fun, right? So the colors don't really tell me anything. It's just a lot and a quazillion arrows. So this is overkill, but I just want to, belabor the point here. This is also the kind of graphics that people use, right? And what I want to point out here is a few things. One, that like the title is going off the slide. People don't always review their slides before they give their presentation, and things are going off the slides. The color here is not working with the yellow and white, is almost impossible to read. And again, what exactly am I supposed to be looking at here? If all you do is talk about this, I still won't know where to look at. So what I recommend, and I'll show you this in a minute, what I recommend in situations like this is, especially if you have a table with lots of information, is use a little red box and highlight, like, where do you want people's attention to go? It's almost like leading a horse, right? Like, you point it in the direction that you want the horse to go. It's the same thing. That you're holding your audience's attention. People are looking at you, right? Where do you want them to look? Top right corner, bottom right corner, left to right, right to left, start in the middle. Like, you tell them, and you can use circles, like I would say, some kind of diagram in red, or, red box or something to highlight where you want people to start looking. And here's a true to life example. So in another project, I developed an intervention. And one way to talk about the intervention is to present this slide to you. And I'm assuming a lot of you have done exactly what I said. You start looking at, what is this, right? Like, where is this prep vaccine? What is this weak stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And if I were doing this presentation and trying to explain to you what we did at week 1, what is this prep conversation? What is this workshop? I probably would have lost you already, because you're already down at the bottom at week 12 in trying to figure out, what does LSMM stand for, et cetera. So when I have given a talk and used this table for a presentation, this is the way I do it, and I recommend you do it as well. So I cover it up. I will say something like, I'm now going to talk to you about how we designed this intervention. I'm going to give you a quick overview. In week one, or the baseline, people, the gay men brought their siblings in. They had a conversation about PrEP in the intervention group. The control group talked about vaccines. And then they left, and the siblings had a workshop on motivational interviewing. In the second week, we sent reminders were emailed to siblings to follow up with their brothers. Then there was an actual follow-up, a call to the sibling. Reminders were emailed to Latino sexual minority men. Then there was an actual follow-up. Reminder emails were sent. And finally, there was a week 12 follow-up. So what I want you to see here is your attention. I held your attention where I wanted it to be, one bit at a time, right? One bit at a time as I explain things so that no one gets ahead of me, right? And I don't lose my audience, right? It's not about, oh, I don't want people ahead of me, for some ego's sake. It's more, I don't want to lose my audience, right? I want to make sure that we're on the same page at every moment, every point that I'm trying to make. So I always suggest covering things up. This makes it easier for you and makes it easier for your audience as well to follow you. And speaking of following, again, back to some of these slides that I saw that I thought were fun. Stop using your slide as a teleprompter. This speaks to do not put everything you're going to say on the slide. It's not necessary. What you're going to say is up here. You're the content expert, right? Like, what do people need to see or read? That's the only thing that goes on the slide, not everything. Slides reinforce your words, right? They don't repeat them, right? I may make a point, maybe the slide makes a point, but I back it up with the story or the anecdote. I don't need to write the whole anecdote or story on the slide. And this is really important. Your audience came to hear you. They didn't come to read. You are the expert. You are the expert on the contents of your presentation. And if we can remember that, and I say that to myself as well, because I get all nervous and jittery before a presentation too, but I try to remind myself, like, I'm the expert. No one knows my project as well as I know my project, right? They came to hear me and what I have to say. People go to hear you and what you have to say, right? Then what you discover, what are your results? What are your thoughts? What do you think are the next steps, right? They don't need to read your slide. They don't need to know everything about every single p-value in your results. In a manuscript, yes. In your presentation, not necessarily. Leave behind a handout or written document. This is a recommendation. I disagree with it. I just wanted to share it with you. Some people believe in handouts. I don't like giving handouts on my presentations, again, because I don't like people getting ahead of me or reading all of it. And if they're going to read it, why bother? And also because, at least in my case, as you saw on the table before, right, a lot of it is covered. When you print that, everything is covered up, right? It doesn't show you what's underneath those, those bars, right? So you're going to give people stuff that may not even make sense. And I cover up a lot in my slides when I present usually. So they're going to get blank slides. But again, I know some of you may like handouts, some of you may not. It's up to you. This is entirely, I think, a preference thing. I don't like them. And going back to people came to hear you and not to read your slides, you're there to sell them on your ideas, right? If everyone in the room agreed with you, you wouldn't have to give your presentation, would you? If everyone in the room already knew what you were talking about or already knew the results of your project, your innovative project, you wouldn't have to be there, right? So it always comes down to you. You are the speaker. You are the presenter. So again, just quick overview. Don't use your slides as teleprompters. Leave a handout if that's your preference, and you have to sell people on your ideas. Any questions before I move on to some more of the nitty-gritty on slides? Does this answer actually Jennifer, you were asking about graphics. Does this answer a bit about graphics, what we talked about a little earlier?
Yes, it does. Not necessarily needed and sometimes actually take away and distract. So just, I guess, being thoughtful in what you add.
And how you use them. You know,
Mhm.
like if you want to use a graph, I say cover parts up. You know, I had a graph showing trends, like 3 different trend lines. I would make one appear at a time, as opposed to showing the entire graph at once, because again, people will be confused by what they see. Any other questions or comments?
There's a question in the chat from Irene
Oh,
Magara.
please
See
speak to
that?
the use of abbreviation, especially when looking at the 7 words. For example, should abbreviations be used and explained by the speaker? Thank you, Dilara. I think it's okay to use abbreviations, but you should be very clear what they are. And I think abbreviations only become a problem when you're expecting your audience to read. But if it's clear what the abbreviation is, and when you're speaking, you're not relying on the abbreviation, I think it should be okay. Again, it's not about the slide, it's about you. So the slide might have an abbreviation, but when you speak, you say the whole word, for example. I'm sorry if I cannot be more helpful because I'm not sure what abbreviations you might be thinking about. The ones that I think about or I tend to use, I usually just speak them out, but I will abbreviate them on the slide. And again, know your audience. If this is a technical abbreviation about in your field and you have a lay audience, maybe don't use the abbreviation. But if you're presenting to, colleagues in your field, people may know what the abbreviation is and it doesn't matter. Right. So I think that's another way to think about it too, is know your audience. Good question. Any other questions? Okay. So simple type styles, 3 styles per slide, keep the same style throughout and limit uppercase use. So I've seen presentations where, and I've done this myself when I was just getting started in this world of research, we use different styles. Times New Roman in the first 4 slides, then it turns to Arial, then it turns to Georgia, then Helvetica, and all kinds of everything. It's all over the place. And I remember my mentor would look at my slides and say, you need to put them all in the same style. And the funny thing is, like, I didn't even have an eye for that because to me, it did look all the same, right? It did look all the same, but, she trained me to really pay attention to, the styles. And it's important to keep the same style throughout. You use your fonts that are easier to read, like the first one, easy to diagnose, easy to cure, preventable. Preventable is italicized. Things that are italicized are usually could be harder to read for some people. Uh, a font sans serif. This type of font, again, is easier to read. Serif could be a little more harder, difficult to read. It's prettier, but it's harder to read, especially when you're doing a presentation, say on stage, and people are looking at your slides at a big distance, right? Not everyone is on Zoom. And also be aware and familiar with the size of the fonts, right? Like titles at 44, what is readable at 32. I try to keep everything at 32 in the body of the slide. Maybe, subheadings at 36 or something like that, but I try to keep everything at 32. The only reason things get really small, I think, is because people are trying to cram too many things into their slide. And so they start making the font smaller and smaller so they can fit more and more and more into it, right? It's like they want to shoehorn their research into one slide, right? And if you stick to the 7 by 7, 30, you can do 32 points and that will be fine. That would be easy enough for people to read. Always use contrasting colors, dark backgrounds with light text. Again, 2 to 3 colors, and lighter colors highlight and emphasize. and some traps. Avoid red letters on a blue background. Avoid red-green combinations because there are people who are colorblind, right? I'm still surprised to see how many folks do this in their presentations, but try not to. Okay, now delivery strategies. Any questions on how to use slides before we move on to the last component of the talk? Okay, thank you, David. Okay, this is a fun part. The next time we do this seminar, it'll be in person, so you can practice delivery strategies. But we'll just talk about them here. So how are your messages read and received? When you give a talk, people remember about 7 to 10% of what you actually said. Your voice and how it carries or projects is 30%. And most of your talk and most of what people remember is your body language. Are you animated? Are you lively? Are you shrinking from the world, hiding behind the podium, reading your notes in your PowerPoint? Talking like a little mouse, right? People will remember that. You could be a Nobel Prize winner and give the message for peace in the world, right? You have the solution for peace in the world, but no one hears you because they're just so distracted by you being so small and tiny, right? So a lot of it comes down to body language. That's not to say that content isn't important, but again, studies show people remember more of your body language than do what you say. Right, so this is important. Now we're really talking about the actual mechanics of giving the talk, delivering the message. Right, we're past just the slides. Always use spoken English rather than written English. And I once had a habit because when you write in English, we know you don't end sentences in a preposition. Right. And I actually picked up the habit of speaking and not ending my sentences in a preposition. Like who does that belong to? Right? Is regular speaking rather than to whom does that belong? Right. And someone actually pointed that out to me. They're like, you speak weirdly. You speak like you're reading a book. Right. Because no one says to whom does that belong. We normally say, who does that belong to? Right. So use spoken rather than written English. Use familiar words. Always avoid jargon. Again, if you're speaking to a crowd of experts like yourself and they already know, then it doesn't matter. But if you're speaking to lay people, don't use jargon, right? And in some circles, depending if you're doing theoretical work, avoid jargon because people might use the words differently or think that that theory works differently, right? There may not be agreement. So just avoid jargon and just say what you mean simply. Speak in simple, to the point sentences. Long, convoluted sentences doesn't make you sound smarter. You just lose your audience. Simple and to the point. And always restate, rephrase if the audience doesn't get it. It's okay to repeat yourself. It's not a sign of you being a lousy speaker or anything like that. Sometimes repetition is a way to reinforce, what people have heard, and that's okay. If it's a new concept or something that's complicated, sometimes people are shy to ask questions or raise their hand, right? So you just repeat it anyway, or I like to repeat things anyway, just to make sure everyone's on board. And one thing someone told me, and I always forget, is it's better not to say, does anyone have any questions, which I'm guilty of in this talk. It's usually better to ask people, is there anything you want me to repeat? Because when you say, does anyone have any questions? The person who asks feels put on the spot because they don't know something, quote unquote, right? Versus you want me to repeat something, right? It could be something they just missed, right? It doesn't put them on the spot so much. That's what someone told me for teaching purposes. So I shared that with you. And again, body language. How do you dress? How you hold yourself, like what the presence that you put out, as the example I gave. Are you like a little mouse hiding behind the lectern, right? Or are you just hello world, putting yourself out there on stage or in front of the podium, wherever you are. How you move, gestures, how you position yourself. Personally, I don't like being behind a lectern. I'd rather have the microphone in hand and just walk around. Keeps people awake, keeps me awake. So that's also something to think about. If you like being behind the lectern, good for you. Practice walking just to expand your style. If you like to walk a lot, like me, the challenge is practice being more animated behind a lectern, right? To expand your style, right? We always have room to grow. And how do you connect with your audience? Do you make eye contact? Depending on the crowd, when I do workshops, I like to walk into the crowd and talk to people, make eye contact. That's not always possible, but you can make eye contact with people in front of you. And it's always what your face says, right? Is it panic-stricken, right? Or is it relaxed and smiling, right? And I must say, even if you are feeling panicked, if you force yourself to smile, your brain will usually say something like, why is he happy? I need to catch up. And you start to relax, right? It's like you force your body into a position, almost like yoga. You force yourself into a weird pose and then your body kind of relaxes into it. You force yourself into a smile and then your body kind of catches up with that, right? And you kind of calm down a bit. And smiles always put people at ease, or most people at ease. So I have to just say, an aside, I was just in New Jersey and where I grew up, if someone's smiling, you're like, why are you smiling? Why are you looking at me? So know your audience, know your audience. Um, and so some key points again, that effective speaking is a learned behavior. No one is born being the greatest orator in humanity. Nothing beats being prepared. And it's okay to do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable in front of the audience, right? You need to go to the, bathroom, do jumping jacks, vocal exercises, power posing, whatever makes you feel more comfortable. And remember, there's a lot of attention to style. It's okay to be flamboyant. It's okay to be a little bit out there, right? Especially if you're one of many talks, people will start dozing off. Like you're just another speaker, right? So it's all about how do you present. You'll have slides that people won't be distracted by and actually engage with, and they'll have you to be engaged with. And as I mentioned earlier, and I've been saying throughout this talk, explore new styles, but also recognize the one you are most comfortable with. It's okay. And don't try to be like anyone else. Develop your own style. And always practice, practice, practice. Even if it's talk you've already given, just review it, just rehearse it. You may have to update a small something here or there. Um, but it's better to practice because you don't know what you don't know until you practice and you realize, oh, I forgot about that slide or I forgot about the order, right? So don't rely just on your past experience. And again, we can all improve our public speaking. We can choose our body language and always practice, 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 and have someone look over your slides as well. That's always useful. And that is the end for me. Any questions or comments? Or if you have a different experience from anything that I shared, please, that's also welcome here.
I just have a comment that was very helpful. I like the part about restating rather than asking if you have a question. I think that is helpful. Because I'm one of those people that gets I guess a little nervous responding to that kind of question if there are questions. I'll use that next time. And then the other thing that I guess I will say sort of talking about my experience is like if I have a big talk coming up or I'm at a meeting, I don't like I'm a person that gets a stage fright pretty easily, so I don't drink coffee in the mornings, and that helps me not get too jittery when I actually have to give my talk.
Okay. So you know yourself, that's good. What else do you do to calm yourself down. I'm going to take a wild guess and say you're not the only person in you're not the only person in at this talk who has a little bit of stage fright or a little bit of panic. Uh, what else do you do besides not drink coffee? That's a good one.
I breathe, like I do like a breathing exercise. Sometimes it's like a formal one, like off of like the Headspace app. And I'll do
Okay.
quiet corner, but most of the time I'll just like go to a corner by myself and just like breathe, do a breathing exercise.
So no coffee, breathing, uh, Susan?
Oh, this is a different comment,
Oh,
different topic, if that's okay. But
okay. Then before I get to you, just one quick second. Anyone else want to share what you do to calm down if you tend to get a little anxious before a talk?
This is probably like during a talk. I usually don't have an actual stress ball with me, but I might like press my fingers together or like hold on tightly to a pen like as I'm talking. And so I'm like calm on
Ah,
the outside, but I might be like squeezing something to just kind of make everything a little bit more even.
oh,
That's
that's great
helped
to
me.
It's funny, Carlos, that you say you don't drink coffee. I usually drink coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, so it definitely affects me. I get all jittery. But for me, I feel like I get hyper and I'm like, next question. Come on, come on. What's next? What's next? What's next? I get all hyper and I feel that helps me present. But so it's funny you say no coffee. Susan,
sure, I'll also just say it following up on what Jennifer was saying, because I also get very nervous when I speak. And I actually like to take the mic off the little holder,
Mhm.
because then when I'm holding the mic, that is kind of like my stress ball, and that really helps me to hold it there instead of just having it there and having to talk at it. So, but yeah, I was just gonna share something that I learned. I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard it a long time ago, but it made sense to me. And so I try to remember to do that, which is a lot of times when people are speaking, they don't like mics. Like, I don't have a problem with mics, but a lot of people don't like microphones. And then they'll say something like, "Oh, it's a small room, and I have a loud voice. So, like, does anybody need me to use the mic?" And then like nobody's going to speak up, and then they don't use the mic, and it's actually very uh, disability unfriendly, because somebody who might not hear that well, and a lot of us, either because you're older or because you're younger but you have a hearing issue, or because you're sitting way in the back of the room, we might not hear that well, or you might not realize initially that, because they might start by talking loud and then get less loud as time goes on. And so you're kind of putting people on the spot. Like, nobody wants to be that person that raises their hand when the speaker
Right.
is stating that they don't want to use the mic. You're not going to raise your hand and say, "Please use the mic." But it's actually kind of obnoxious. And I just heard this again when I was at a little conference, the other day, when somebody said that and said, "Oh, nobody minds if I don't use the mic, right?" And I wanted to raise my hand and say, "Well, even though I can hear you, I think you should still use the mic." But I didn't. I thought, "Oh, I don't want to be a pill." But just be aware, like, the mic's there for a reason. There's no reason not to use the mic. If you're uncomfortable with mics, practice with the mic and use it, because. So anyway, just wanted to share that.
That's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing. I've also been in situations where people say, it's okay if I don't use the mic, right? And proceed. And I feel like, at least in my experience, everyone who has said that has been overconfident. It's like, no, honey, you do need a mic. You go get that mic now. I'm sitting up front, I can barely hear you. And also, I think it takes away from our ability to speak naturally, in the sense that, sometimes you tell a story, you might say like, and then she said, guess what she said, right? Like, that doesn't project really far in a small room, right? And so now you're kind of compelled to have to yell everything. So I think using a mic is called for. And in full disclosure, I have been one of those folks before, but I'm pretty confident that it really, really was a tiny room, and I could be pretty loud, but I hear what you said, and I will not do that anymore. Point taken. Yes, I don't want to be that person. Yeah, like I said, I'm confident, but everyone is confident that they can. So probably overconfident, incorrectly, unjustifiably so. Any other comments or questions or something you would like me to repeat or
I
review?
did
Yes.
have a comment.
Mhm.
I used to work with teenagers and, with health education with teenagers. And one of the things that I learned is asking, what questions do you have? So just assuming that the group has questions, just especially for masculine presenting folks, they're less likely to want to ask questions to the group. So yeah, that's all.
Okay. What questions do you have that works? Yeah. And again, know your audience, and know your style. Yeah. I know people speak up against putting people on the spot, like saying, "So, Susan, you tell me, or Jennifer, why don't you repeat back what I just said?" Right? So I don't recommend it, but I have to confess, I'm not opposed to putting people on the spot. It could create opportunities for fun sometimes. Again, know your audience. It could be fun, right? It might be an opportunity to introduce a little humor and to repeat some things. But again, I think generally don't, but again, be open to it. You never know. Okay.
Yeah, so I think this is it for our time in the method seminar. Thanks so much to everybody for joining. Gerald put the QR code for your evals, which is super important to us and for Dr. Del Pino. And I believe the link is also in the chat.
Right, exactly.
Okay. I appreciate it, Amaro. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I'm going back to my conference.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it. So we're gonna just transition over to our method.